If you've been worshiping with us these Wednesdays in Lent, that you know our theme has been real God, real life, and we've had wonderful members of Easter telling real life stories about how God has entered into their lives in different ways. And tonight I'm not going to say much because Matt tells his own story so beautifully, so I'll just introduce to you Matt Franken, who is a pretty long-time member of Easter now, who has a wonderful story to share.
The gospel story tonight is about healing and about affliction, and I think we all experience affliction in some form or another, and like the blind man in the gospel, I think most of us have prayed for healing from some ailment, be it mental, spiritual, or physical at some time. And I'd like to share some thoughts this evening about my family's experience with affliction, faith, and healing. My immediate family is pretty small. I've got a bigger extended family, but my immediate family is just me, my wife Kate, and my son Henry. And they're everything to me. And since the day we welcomed Henry into the world, I knew that being his father was the most important thing I would ever do. Henry came into our lives as a very fussy, noisy, and mostly sleepless infant. The first 6 months of his life were exhausting, but we were thrilled to have been blessed with this child. And once we got past the reflux and sleep issues, he became a really easy, good kid. And with a sense of pride and love and amazement, we watched him grow over the years from an infant to a toddler to a happy, healthy boy. The idea of something happening to him is almost more than I can bear. I think there's a reason why biblical themes involving the loss or sacrifice of one's child are so powerful. The faith of Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son Isaac, or the idea of God sacrificing his son for our sins. These take on an even greater significance when you become a parent. So in the fall of 2015, we were up at the cabin for the long MEA weekend, and Henry complained about a headache. And after a little while, he got sick and he threw up. But he felt fine after that, so we didn't think a whole lot about it. But when we got home, the headache and the nausea returned. And again a few days after that. And we started to get a little bit worried. So we took him into his pediatrician, and she suggested that we follow up with a neurologist. And we did. And after examining Henry, she thought that everything probably looked like it was okay, but just to be safe, she wanted a follow-up test to rule out anything significant. So she recommended that we take him in for an MRI. Kate was diligent about getting the procedure scheduled, and so on the day before Thanksgiving of 2015, she took him to the appointment. I went to work looking forward to a long holiday weekend and expecting to receive a call from her a few hours later telling me that everything looked good. But I didn't get that call. Instead, Kate texted and told me that I needed to get to the clinic. There, the radiologist showed us the scans. And instead of showing a normal, healthy 10-year-old brain, the MRI revealed a golf ball-sized tumor that was pressing into his cerebellum. And so on that day, November 25th, 2015, it became the worst, hardest day of my life. We went to Children's Hospital that night and met with a neurosurgeon, Dr. Mahmoud Naguib, who told us that he thought the tumor looked benign, but that it needed to come out. He explained to us that the tumor had blocked the normal drainage pathways for what's called cerebrospinal fluid, which circulates all around the brain, and it caused his intracranial pressures to rise, which caused headaches. He sent us home with a prescription for steroids to reduce the swelling and to get Henry's brain ready for surgery. Needless to say, Thanksgiving that year took on a very different feel as we waited and wondered with fear and trepidation what we were dealing with and what would happen and what would be the result. So on the Monday after Thanksgiving, we headed back to Children's for the first of 2 planned procedures. In this first procedure, Dr. Naguib installed a drain. It's a small tube, really, through a spot at the top of Henry's forehead that went deep into his brain with the intent of alleviating the fluid buildup to help get his brain ready for surgery. After that, we waited in the hospital for word on when he would have the second procedure, which would be a major, hugely invasive surgery with the goal of accessing and removing the tumor. There's an old expression that there are no atheists in a foxhole, and I think that there probably aren't any in a pediatric intensive care unit either. We were surrounded there by families whose children were undergoing serious health crises. We saw more than one group of people shedding tears over the health of a young child, and other families saw us doing the same thing. I spent a lot of time on my knees praying that my son would be okay, and I remember thinking back to the story of Martin Luther that I heard when I was in confirmation classes, being caught in a storm and nearly struck by lightning. And according to the story, Luther prayed and promised God that if he spared him, he would dedicate his life to study and become a monk. And so I bargained with God too, and I offered my faith and all sorts of promises if he would save my son. And I think being asked to speak here tonight seems like an oddly specific way of having me fulfill some of those promises. So, a couple of days after the first procedure, we received word that the big surgery had been scheduled. And so early on the morning of December 3rd, we signed the consent forms for what's called a posterior fossa craniotomy and put our faith in God to guide the surgical team and keep our beloved son safe. It was a lengthy, invasive procedure fraught with terrifying potential complications like temporary loss of speech, loss of balance, loss of motor control, and other neurological issues that might not even show up for several days. So as Dr. Naguib and his team operated, we waited and paced and worried and prayed. And after many hours, Dr. Naguib emerged from the operating room, and I'll never forget this. He had a big smile on his face, and he came out and he said, "It looks great." He had completely removed the tumor, and he thought that it looked like it was benign. And a day later, we were relieved to find that the pathology had confirmed that it was, in fact, benign. And a few days after that, we were out of the woods when the truly frightening complications didn't materialize. We spent the next nearly 2 weeks in the hospital and doing a very hard recovery before finally being discharged home. We were truly fortunate here. The type of tumor that Henry had was called a juvenile pilocytic astrocytoma, did not require any additional treatment following its removal. So he didn't have to undergo chemotherapy or radiation or anything like that. And the type of tumor that he had is so unlikely to return that oncologists can actually use the word cured. Henry's doctor told us that that's not a word that she gets to use in her practice very often. So we didn't have a roadside miracle, but we experienced real healing. And for me, there's a contemplative aspect that comes along with all this. We had some really hard questions while we were going through this, chief among them being, why did this happen to our son? Pediatric brain tumors are fortunately pretty rare, but man, if you're going to beat the odds at something, why couldn't it have been the lottery? And apart from these hard questions, there was just the simple shock of the experience. There was a disruption in our lives, a sense of loss of security in the everyday. We became keenly aware of how fragile life is. We stared into that abyss and saw some pretty scary things, but we were able to pull back. Yeah, but it's interesting, life goes on. And presumably, life went on for the blind man in the gospel story whose vision was restored. But I do wonder what he did next. I'm sure he was grateful for the restoration of his sight, but I wonder if he asked God why he had been struck blind in the first place. And even though he was cured and his vision had been restored, I wonder how long his healing process lasted, maybe the rest of his life. I don't want to stand up here and sound self-pitying because I know how fortunate we were to receive the good result that we had hoped and prayed and begged for. But in my mind, this raises an almost harder and maybe a little bit more awkward question. Why were we so lucky? Unlike that blind man in the gospel, I can tell you that it wasn't because of the strength of my faith. There are many, many people who are more faithful than I am. God oftentimes seems far away. My educational background is in science and law, which favor objective observation and logical reasoning, and you can't use the scientific method to prove the existence of God. So faith can sometimes be a struggle. But put into context here, I know that it wasn't my inadequate faith that saved my son, but we received the best answer to our prayers that we could have hoped for. So why us? And more significantly, I guess, why not everyone else? Even though these tumors are rare, there are lots of kids in the cities who are diagnosed with tumors and cancer and horrible ailments. Dr. Naguib, we learned, performs a surgery like this just about every single week. If you think about that, that's 50 kids in the Twin Cities with brain tumors every single year. And many of these children are from families of deep, abiding faith, and yet lots of prayers for healing seem to go unanswered. Looking around the oncology floor at Children's when we were there, we saw a lot of kids whose treatments were harder and more prolonged than Henry's, and whose prognoses were much less favorable. We saw heartache and fear and unfulfilled hope and seemingly unanswered prayers. So why were we so fortunate when others around us were not? I can tell you right now, I don't know the answer to that. That's a bigger theological question that I'm certainly capable of answering. But a few thoughts occurred to me as I ruminated on this discussion tonight. First, I think that God does answer our prayers, but it's not always in the specific way we want or hope. We pray for healing when confronted with illness, but healing isn't always just about curing afflictions. I think healing is really about getting better. And unlike the miracle experienced by the blind man in the gospel, healing can be a long process. We found that out firsthand. Even with all of the good news we received with Henry, the healing process was long and difficult. The surgeon removed his tumor a week and a day after we discovered it, but the healing process took a really long time. After the surgery, he spent nearly 2 weeks in the hospital, and these were tough days spent tethered to IV lines and monitors and machines that beeped and assessments at all hours of the night. There were days filled with hard, tear-inducing sessions with a physical therapist as she tried to get Henry's body working again. And even after being discharged, many weeks passed before Henry was able to go to school full-time and recover his full stamina. God answered our prayers and healed our son, but it was a long, hard journey. I think the second thought is healing doesn't always, unfortunately, mean a cure for what we're looking for. I think, again, healing it's really about getting better, and that can take a lot of different forms. And so instead of a cure, sometimes maybe healing means gaining the ability to come to terms with a bad prognosis, or mustering the strength to accept that the road to recovery may be bumpier and less certain than hoped for. Finding the courage to accept that sometimes things end badly and there isn't a cure. And I think it can include healing the heartache suffered by those left behind when someone cherished is lost. Just because a specific prayer isn't answered, I think, doesn't mean that God isn't listening and responding. A final thought here is that healing isn't usually something that happens through miracles, other than some enterprising televangelists who would be more than happy to offer you a miracle in exchange for a small contribution to their ministry. I think we don't really live in an era of non-scientific miracles. But I think healing happens because of the people around us through whom God works. A team of highly skilled and experienced doctors and nurses healed Henry, from his pediatrician who suggested following up with a neurologist, to that neurologist who recommended an MRI, to the neurosurgeon who removed the tumor, to the nurses and staff doctors and therapists who cared for Henry during recovery. We were blessed to benefit from the skills and talents of so many people. And it wasn't just healthcare providers who helped us heal. We were surrounded by good, caring people throughout our community and in so many aspects of our lives. During the weekend between Henry's diagnosis and his hospitalization, Kate and I met with Pastor Chris, and we talked about the advice that was given to one of my favorite theologians, Fred Rogers, who you may remember as the kindly host of the PBS television program about his neighborhood. But Mr. Rogers was actually an ordained Presbyterian minister. Mr. Rogers said that when he was a child and he saw something bad or frightening reported in the news, his mother told him to look for the helpers. And we did that, and we saw helpers all around us during our ordeal. Our pastors all came and visited and prayed with us. Our parents and siblings and friends showered Henry with gifts and brought us meals and sneaked wine in and kept us company during the surgery and during that long stretch in the hospital. People that we didn't know prayed for us and sent their best wishes for Henry's recovery. And I truly believe that God worked through all of these people to help all of us in my small family heal. It's been over a year now since we went through all this, and the tests and signs so far have continued to be good. And we think that everything will continue to be good going forward. And even though I think we're out of the woods, it's something that I still think about quite often. And I'm left with this thought, though, that even though faith can be hard sometimes, and even though we don't always get the answers that we hope for, I choose to hold on to a faith that God works through our family and friends and community to provide healing and answers to our prayers.